Look, thank you very much, Roisin, for the introduction and the invite to present here today. Um, I suppose just to set a wee bit of context in relation to the presentation here this morning, this is set in the context of a developing destination experience plan for counties Meath and Louth. And as part of that, we looked at, part of that is about unlocking the heritage asset and revealing the landscape relevant to that particular destination. And as a lot of you will know, the landscape up in Meath and Louth is awash with heritage assets, and we're blessed with a number of wonderful walled towns as well, namely in Carlingford, Drogheda and Trim. But I have to say as well, Ireland's Ancient East, as a brand concept that talks to the whole concept of exploring place through time, sits very, very well for the promotion and the presentation of walled towns. And I suppose the lion's share of the walled towns within the network, I have to say, is within Ireland's Ancient East. So delighted to have the opportunity to chat here this morning. We looked in developing our destination at reimagining the Boyne Valley Drive. And in doing that, we wanted to look at how we would potentially interpret our heritage assets. So what we've done here is, sorry, this is moving a wee bit quicker than I thought, or not as quick as it should perhaps. So look, before we start, let me pose the question to you: what is interpretation here? And this is where we started when we looked at the whole project that we were doing. Interpretation can be a number of things. You can see here on the image, top left looks at just a trail of I suppose, inscribed narrative on a metal path. That tells a story relevant to place. The second one is a wonderful way of considering to your interpretation, where you just look through a frame to see a scene, and within that scene, the narrative relative to it below. That's all interpretation as well. Again, if we get to the modern day, we have the app and phone, and what we can do with technology, very, very important in terms of how we call our interpretation. Bottom left shows more traditional way of interpreting, and we'll see this as we get through the presentation here as well. It's a combination of narrative, image, and I suppose map locators to show where you are, and this ties to a particular specific filament site. Again, interpretation can be presented in a different way. You can see bottom center here as well. It can be a sculpture, which tells a story in itself as well. And indeed, the bottom right-hand one, very interesting for us in the Boyne Valley in Meath and Louth, where we just use the landscape to tell a story. And within that, look at creative ways of presenting the narrative. So I suppose, before we start, we have to take a look at what interpretation's about. And for us, it's all about the place. We have to think why we are presenting information and how we're presenting the information. So on this slide, you're seeing where we have put the place. In this instance, the Boyne Valley, Meath and Louth at the centre, but there's so many other things to consider around the place. We have the particular project in question that we're looking at. We have the information we're going to provide. We have to consider it in the context of a developing destination, what it means to the community as well. And from a tourism development perspective, what role the interpretation can play for us. That is set within the context of a wider bubble here as well, where we have the community in place. We have the business owners, we have the strategic partners, be they local authority or the OPW or indeed the walled network here. We have landowners. We need to consider all the different players when we're coming to present an interpretation. So when we ask the question, why are we going to do this? We need to consider the project in the context of a number of aims and objectives. And these are very, very important. Getting the balance on the aims and objectives is so important, because it is asking that question as to why. And it is the big best way of sharing the story. So what we see on screen here is 4 main objectives relevant to our patch and our project. We wanted to look at the educational aspect of things that tell the facts and give the understanding of the site and present accurate information. We also want to play to the emotional side of things as far as the visitor's concerned. So here's where we tie to place, sense of place. We try to incorporate the interpretation into an experience relevant to that particular site. We want to play to the behavioral instincts of visitors as well too. We want it to be memorable. It has to resonate with the reader. So and it has to I suppose tell the message, encourage them to come back and have a lasting effect on them. And of course, we want it to act like a lot of people use interpretation from a promotional perspective. It has to meet the needs of the audience. It has to appeal to different audiences, and we'll look at what that means throughout the presentation as we go here. We must understand the role of all the different people that touch on the journey of interpretation here as well too. I'm not going to read these, but you can see there are so many people and organizations and considerations when it comes to looking at interpretation. And the project we were involved in, we looked at and considered all of these here for the purposes of trying to get the right message relevant to the objective and the aims of the project. So moving on from that, then we looked at the process, and the process for us is set in place, no doubt about it. That comes through in everything that we do here. And it's a 3-step process then in terms of what's involved. There is the interpretive plan. That's where we look at the audience, the aims, the themes we want to bring to the fore, the stories we want to bring relevant to that site. Then the next stage is very, very important. It's the research around bringing those aims and objectives to life. So you have to research what it is you need to do and say, and then consider how you want to present that. Back to my opening slide about what is interpretation. It can be sensitive to the area. It doesn't have to be a board as we might know it. So the idea is to get the right mix and balance in terms of how interpretation talks to place. And then we need to consider as well, in sensitive landscapes, how we deliver that. And there's a whole process involved right through from the tender process associated with how we do this, and then the fabrication of the entire interpretation and what that looks like. And as I said, it can be different things in different places. The installation, and very important thereafter, the management and maintenance of this, because it has to remain constant and relevant to people. So for the purposes of our project, again, we looked at how we might interpret our destination town of Trim, and indeed wall town of Trim. So taking on board the interpretive plan, we thought about our audience and our aims, our themes and our stories. And in doing that, we wanted to primarily engage international visitors here, but also to encourage local people to take ownership and for local stories to come through. Our aims were multiple fold here. We wanted to make connections with the landscape and the place. We wanted to make the place accessible through good interpretation. We wanted it to be engaging in terms of how it talked to the visitor. Again, we wanted to offer opportunities where people could be relaxed in the atmosphere and in the landscape where they were. It had to be factual for certain audiences as well too, but it also had to be fun, I suppose, for different audiences, be that family or kids as well. And it had to be appropriate in that way to the audience we were talking to. And very important, relevant to sense of place. Now, the themes that we called out here for our project in Trim, we wanted this to talk to the natural environment. The River Boyne is the spine within the Boyne Valley, and a lot of the historic assets are set along the shores of the river. So we wanted it to talk to the river, and very importantly, to connect with the local people and the local stories. So in this instance, what we did here, quite simply focusing in on the castle itself, we looked at points where A represents the arrival point to the entry point of the destination. And in this instance here, you need to have signage at different points throughout the site. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 represents places where we looked at putting stories relevant to the site and interpreting them in different ways. And here's some of the ways that we have considered that we need to bring the interpretation and the story to life here. We want to keep the landscape open. Top left just tells the story of how you can orientate people through the landscape on the site. Importantly, top and in center here, the hero image and narrative. This is more the traditional interpretation that we called here, but you can see the context in which we have set. We have a hero image. And we have a title where we're talking about where Trim meets its castle, because that connects the castle to the place. We have maps for orientation, and we have a maximum of 100 words, but narrated in a way that is very relevant to place. I'm conscious of time as well, and I have a heavy slide deck, so you can read the detail in this as we go. I want to point out some of the specific sites then that we looked at relevant to place as well. Thinking of our aims and objectives here, we looked at an example of where a pillory exists here, but we wanted to make that more than just the pillory itself. So around the actual pillory, we have a narrated story that is in a lead piece on the ground, but that explains what it is. So we have called out what happened, and the person and the reader here can relate to how this had its place in time as far as Trim and the castle was concerned. Then we added to that, obviously, a simple bit of narration that explains what a pillory is, how it was used in the context of living in that time in Trim. And we have kept it very simple in terms of the narrative, but also used an image to explain what that is about. It connects with the town as well. There is an image, there is a pillory street in Trim. We're not sure where it is, but again, you can tell that story relevant to this particular exhibit here as part of the interpretation. And it connects the castle with the town. Now, our main piece of interpretation here has a hero image, which draws you back, connects to the river as well. And we have got then a maximum of 100 words that tells the story relevant to place. But this must seek relevance to the journey of the visitor in the landscape, and it must be set in the wider context as well. You can see what we've tried to do on the left-hand side of the image here, where we have a constant on all our interpretation going forward. The River Boyne, that is the constant here in the Boyne Valley. We show that in the context of a locator map as well. And importantly, what we do here is we keep the story very relevant to the then and now. So to read a little bit of this, we're talking about taking a stroll outside the castle walls, view the town, view the river, and relax our walk along the river, which people have known for 5,000 years. We talk about times back to St. Patrick and the different periods of time across the 5,000 years as well. So in doing that, then you can locate where you are. You can send people on a journey to the next site that tells a story as well too. We have added into our interpretation here as well. We want to take people on a journey. Trim means elder trees. That's what Trim means in its Irish translation here. So we have called that out on a sign, and we have asked people to watch out for the elder tree. You can still see them there in sight. So you're intriguing people to look out and explore the landscape relevant to the interpretation. And that's important as well. Now, I'm flying through this, so bear with me. I want to touch on a number of things. Moving on here now to actually the hardware. The hardware is important as well, for it must sit within the context of the place and the landscape as well. And there's a number of considerations that you need to think of. You need to think of the place where it's going. It has to be appropriate to that particular site. We need to think of maintenance. Down the line, we need to make sure that this is easy to maintain, and the cost of maintaining it, and indeed the cost of putting it in. So it's important that we consider that as well. Now, I'm showing you again how we are thinking of our audience here. And as we move and orientate along the site, we're keeping the same theme in terms of how we present the information, but we're talking to a different audience or offering a different perspective in line with our aims and objectives. This particular narrative here talks to the perspective of a viewpoint of a child. So a different audience can understand then what this is telling the story relevant to that place. So the narrative here is about telling that story, whether it's the daughter of a soldier who lived in the castle or a family from a baker shop in the town in the Middle Ages. This is told from the child's perspective and what the days were like from a child's perspective. Moving on as well, then at certain points, we talk to maybe how the child would have helped out in its time during the day. We look at the whole idea of the coracle here in terms of how it may have been used and the story in relation to it. It's a boat, obviously an early boat going back, as has been used across the 5,000 years in the Boyne Valley. But we have told a story because it's relevant to the river. It would have been important as a mode of transport and getting people across the river as well. It would have been used to fish. You can tell the story then of how that particular piece of way of living relates to the site. You can then dive deeper around what the child may have done during the day as well too. You can connect with the past. You know, some children's games in this instance haven't changed in centuries, and you can transport the reader here back to their childhood in some way, because games like hopscotch or skipping is still very relevant to the younger audience today. And this is links to a soft way of learning too, where a younger audience can relate to how children lived in the past as well too. So it's important that you consider your many audiences as well and pivot your communication and your style of communication to those particular audiences. Now, if we think back to our aims and objections, this is about making connections to the land place as well, to the landscape as well. And we can use physical objects to tell a story. So, for example, whilst these aren't in place yet, but we could potentially look at using a series of pathway blocks, or indeed other blocks with scribe stories. For example, there would have been a gate that would have connected the castle across the moat, or indeed the river perhaps, or a bridge. If that's not there, you can put some structures in the landscape that tells that story in a creative way and shows that it's just not, you're just not saying here's what it was like, you're showing something in the landscape that connects the place in a way where it could have been the story could have been told in a different way from the past. So moving on then around the site, it's important as well that we consider how the people visit a site and what they might do. People need to rest and relax and enjoy the site as well. So place is always at the central, and this is where we want to do more with less, to use the term of that I've called out in the presentation here. And in this instance, we're talking about taking that coracle as well, and maybe using it for the purposes of creating seating along the river. You can tell the story again on the rim of the coracle. You could plant trees, you could plant elder trees relevant to the place and the name. You can use that little bit of imagery relevant to time as part of your interpretation as well. So it becomes part of the journey along the river. And you can tell the story, be that relevant to the coracle itself, how it was worked, how it was used as a boat or a means of transport. You can tell it from the viewpoint of the people that may have used it. It could have been a monk, it could have been a trader from the time, it could have been a soldier or a farmer. It would have been made from local produce, hazel or willow, so you can tell that story and relate to it, to how it sits in the landscape, and indeed for the purposes of making a living and landscape, making a living and the food associated with fishing, and how the landscape was used for the purposes of providing food. Now, I'm very conscious of time. We've moved 20 minutes, so I'm going to sum up here now in terms of looking at the steps I've talked through here very briefly and what that means. We looked at a process that had 4 steps: an interpretive plan, a brief to deliver on that plan, then a very important step-by-step guide in terms of the interpretive design that tells the story relevant to place, and consideration to our delivery then. And I suppose very briefly, each of these talks to the interpretive plan, gets right back to the place. I'm not going to read this verbatim here, but in essence, it just questions why the interpretation is needed at that place and what the aims are. It considers the audience, very important in terms of us understanding how we talk to a site relevant to the audience. The themes and stories linked to that audience as well too. Very important that we connect those, and we give consideration to the delivery aspect. Moving on to the brief, we give consideration then to the skills that's needed. We need to ask ourselves, be that of our local communities, our local authorities, or the people who lead in this, have we the skills to do this ourselves? Do we need to draw in help? How do we consider the sensitivity of the site? Who do we involve in that to understand how we can use and interpret the site? All of that will impinge upon programme and budget. And indeed, the consultation around that is very, very important in terms of how you come to an end part on the journey. And again, I suppose here's where the creative thinking can come into the whole area of interpretation. The interpretive design, it's right back to the research, what it is we're going to say, how we're going to say it. Can the site talk to itself first and foremost? If the site can talk for itself, let the site talk for itself, because the visitor can immerse themselves in that. Then when we're looking at how we consider the introduction of text and words, you know, there is good practice that looks at wording, you know, a hero image. An image can say 1,000 words, as the saying goes here, and the narrative that we use, keep till a maximum of 100 words. And we need to keep visuals relevant to that audience, and ask questions about how we deliver it. Is digital an option? Are other structures an option in terms of how we tell that story? And last, but not least, stage 4 then is looking at the delivery. Very important we keep signage relevant. We can all, I'm sure, everyone in the room today can relate to projects where signage has gone up and the sign has gone in the ground, and that's it there forever and a day. To keep signage and interpretation relevant to place, there has to be a management structure associated with it. So we need to understand who's looking after the interpretation, whose job is to do what. We need to consider the suppliers involved here as well. If there's maintenance involved, we need to make sure there's access to site to do that, and the type of suppliers that we need to deliver and to keep the interpretation as needed. We need to understand any special requirements relevant to place within this, and all aspects of the delivery of the project thereafter in terms of the interpretation, understanding how it's performing, keep it fresh, and consider how it can be updated in the terms of ongoing maintenance and protecting, I suppose, the investment in the interpretation relevant to place. Now, I do appreciate that's a very quick overview on our project that we were involved in. I just skimmed along the top really in terms of what we touched. There was actually 4 half days work in the presentation I've just given you here, and that brought us right down into understanding the process that was involved. But hopefully it's given you a good oversight as to the journey we went on and how we tried to, I suppose, back to the title of the presentation here, do more with less. We wanted the landscape to tell the story, and we were just, I suppose, facilitating through clever interpretation, bringing the landscape to life and giving the visitor the opportunity to understand the historic asset and to understand it in the context of place. So that's me. Probably run a wee tad over time. Sorry on that, Roisin. I'll stop sharing now and happily take any questions that there may be.